The thunder cracked through the sky, echoing across the valley like a warning shot as Beau Northrop pulled his hat down tighter against the driving rain. His mare, Whiskey, was skittish beneath him, sensing the danger in the air as they approached the edge of Duro Creek, normally a gentle stream that cut through Palisade, Colorado, but now a raging, swollen beast that threatened to devour everything in its path. The bridge, the only connection between the town and the Wallace homestead on the other side, was creaking dangerously, its wooden supports groaning under the pressure of the floodwaters. Beau had been in town buying supplies when the storm hit, and the news had spread like wildfire. Penelope Wallace and her younger sister were stranded on their farm with the creek rising by the minute. Their parents had been in Denver for the past week, leaving the girls alone to tend the homestead. No one else was foolish enough to attempt a crossing with the waters so high. But Beau couldn't shake the image of Penelope's face from his mind, those determined green eyes that had caught his attention the first moment he'd ridden into Palisade 6 months ago. "Can't let them face this alone," he muttered, gauging the surging water that now lapped at the edges of the bridge. The timber structure shuddered with each wave that crashed against it. It wouldn't hold much longer. Sheriff Mills had tried to stop him. "You're courting death, Northrop. That bridge won't hold another hour in this deluge." But Beau knew what he had to do. His ranch hand, Miguel, stood at the edge of town with several other concerned citizens, watching as Beau approached the bridge. "Northrop," Miguel called out, "there's another way, the old trader's path. It'll take you 3 hours to circle around." "Those girls don't have 3 hours," Beau shouted back over the howling wind. "If that bridge goes, they'll be cut off for weeks." The rain was relentless, soaking through his duster as if it were made of paper rather than oiled canvas. The creek had already spilled over its banks, and the muddy water churned with debris, branches, fence posts, and once, alarmingly, what looked like part of someone's barn roof. The bridge groaned louder, as if protesting the very thought of him crossing. Beau took a deep breath. He'd faced down rustlers, survived a Comanche raid back in Texas, and once went 3 days without water when he got lost in the Badlands. But this made his heart hammer against his ribs like a wild thing trying to escape. It wasn't the danger that frightened him. It was the thought of failing, of not reaching Penelope in time. He'd never told her how he felt. Every time he'd mustered the courage to speak to her after Sunday services or at the town socials, the words had dried up in his throat like creek beds in August. She was educated, had been to a real ladies' school back east before her family moved west, and Beau was just a cowboy with calloused hands and dreams bigger than his pockets. But none of that mattered now, not with her life in danger. "Come on, girl," he urged Whiskey forward. The mare balked, tossing her head. I know, but we've got to try." The first wooden plank creaked ominously under their weight. Beau dismounted, deciding it would be safer to lead Whiskey across rather than ride. The bridge swayed with each step, the raging water just inches below the slats now. Halfway across, a section of railing tore away, swept downstream in an instant. "Steady," he soothed, though whether he was talking to Whiskey or himself, he wasn't sure. 3/4 of the way across, the bridge gave a sickening lurch. Whiskey panicked, rearing up with a terrified whinny. Beau grabbed her reins with both hands, speaking low and steady until she calmed enough to continue. They were almost to the other side when he heard a crack like gunfire as one of the main support beams splintered. "Run!" Beau shouted, slapping Whiskey's flank. The mare bolted forward and Beau ran after her, his boots pounding against the buckling wood. The bridge was coming apart behind him, planks tearing away into the churning water. With a desperate leap, Beau cleared the last few feet, landing hard on the muddy bank just as the bridge collapsed with a thunderous crash. Whiskey stood trembling several yards away, but safe. Beau turned to see the bridge, their only way back to town, disappear beneath the floodwaters. The reality of his situation struck him. He was now as stranded as the Wallace sisters, with miles of flooded creek between them and Palisade. But he'd made it across. That was what mattered. The Wallace homestead was about a mile from the creek crossing, nestled against the foothills where the land began to rise. Beau caught Whiskey's reins and hauled himself into the saddle, urging her into a gallop despite the treacherous mud. The rain continued to fall in sheets, and in the distance, he could see that the creek had already overflowed its banks near the Wallace property. As they crested the final rise, Beau's heart sank. Water surrounded the modest two-story farmhouse, already reaching the porch steps. The barn looked to be on slightly higher ground, but the chicken coop was half submerged and the garden was completely underwater. "Penelope," he shouted as he approached, guiding Whiskey through the shallower parts of the flood. "Miss Wallace." The front door of the house burst open, and there she stood, Penelope Wallace, her chestnut hair falling loose around her shoulders, wearing a simple blue dress with the sleeves rolled up to her elbows. Relief flooded her face when she saw him, quickly followed by disbelief. "Mr. Northrop. How on earth did you?" "The bridge just made it across before it washed out," he said, dismounting at the edge of the porch and tying Whiskey to the railing. "Where's your sister?" "Alice is upstairs, gathering what she can," Penelope explained, her voice steadier than he would have expected given the circumstances. "The water started coming in about an hour ago. We've moved everything we could to the upper floor, but it's rising so fast." A crash from inside the house made them both turn. Alice, just 16, appeared in the doorway, her arms full of books and papers. "The kitchen shelf collapsed," she explained, her eyes widening at the sight of Beau. "You crossed the creek. They said in town it couldn't be done." "Sometimes folks are wrong about what can't be done," Beau replied, removing his hat as he stepped onto the porch. Water sloshed around his boots, already an inch deep. "But we don't have much time. This whole place could be underwater by nightfall." "What about the livestock?" Penelope asked, her brow furrowing. "We managed to get the horses to higher ground this morning, but the milk cow is still in the barn with her calf." "I'll get them," Beau said, already turning back to Whiskey. "You two keep packing whatever you can't bear to lose." "We need to move to higher ground as soon as possible." "But where will we go?" Alice asked, clutching her books tighter. "With the bridge gone, the old Thompson place," Penelope interjected. "It's abandoned, but the cabin's still standing. It's up on that ridge east of here." Beau nodded. "I know it. That'll do for now." He paused, looking at Penelope directly. "Your parents won't be back for at least another week," she finished for him. "By then maybe the waters will have receded enough to rebuild the bridge." "Or I'll figure out another way to get you both back to town," Beau promised. "Now, let me see to that cow while you finish here." As he slogged through the rising water toward the barn, Beau felt a curious mix of dread and exhilaration. The situation was dire, no doubt about it. But there was something about being here, being needed by Penelope Wallace, that made his chest feel tight in a way that had nothing to do with fear. The barn door was swollen from the rain and took his shoulder to force open. Inside, Buttercup, the Wallace family's Jersey cow, lowed anxiously, her calf huddled against her side. The water was already seeping through the floorboards. "Come on, old girl," Beau murmured, approaching slowly so as not to spook her. "Let's get you somewhere dry." It took some coaxing, but he managed to get a lead rope on Buttercup and pick up the calf, which was thankfully small enough to carry. Outside, the rain had eased slightly, but the water continued to rise, now halfway up the porch steps of the house. When he returned, Penelope and Alice had assembled a pile of essentials: clothing, food supplies, blankets, and their most treasured possessions. Penelope had changed into more practical attire, trousers that must have belonged to her father, tucked into sturdy boots, and a heavy coat over her blouse. "We'll need to take turns on whiskey," Beau said, setting down the calf. "She can't carry all three of us plus your belongings." "Alice should ride," Penelope said immediately. "I can walk." "No arguments there," her sister replied, already reaching for the bundle containing her books. They worked quickly, securing their provisions to Whiskey's saddle, with Alice mounting up afterward. Penelope took charge of the calf, while Beau led both his mare and Buttercup. The going was slow, with water now reaching mid-calf in some places as they made their way east toward the ridge. "I never did thank you properly," Penelope said quietly as they trudged through the mud. "For coming across that bridge, no one else would have." Beau kept his eyes on the path ahead. "Couldn't leave you stranded. Still, it was incredibly brave." She was watching him with those clear green eyes that always made him feel as though she could see right through him. "Or incredibly foolish. I haven't decided which." That brought a smile to his lips despite everything. "Probably both, Miss Wallace." "Penelope," she corrected him. "I think circumstances warrant first names, don't you?" "Penelope," he repeated, liking the way it felt to say it out loud after all these months of thinking it. "I'm Beau." "I know who you are, Beau Northrop," she said, and there was something in her voice that made him glance at her sharply. "Everyone in Palisade knows the Texas cowboy who bought the old Fletcher place and turned it around in less than a year." "Not much of an accomplishment," he said modestly, though pride warmed him at her words. "That's not what my father says. He says you've got a knack for ranching that most men twice your age don't possess." Before Beau could respond to this unexpected compliment, Alice called back to them. "I can see the cabin, but there's water all around it too." Sure enough, as they crested a small rise, the old Thompson cabin came into view. It was situated on higher ground than the Wallace homestead, but even here, the floodwaters had crept up to surround the structure, though they hadn't yet breached the cabin itself. "The slope behind it leads up to drier ground," Beau observed. "We can get the animals up there and then see about making the cabin habitable." The rain had finally stopped by the time they reached the cabin, but dark clouds still loomed overhead, promising more to come. The building itself was sturdier than Beau had expected. Sam Thompson had built it to last before consumption claimed him 3 years back. The door was stuck, but a solid kick from Beau broke the swollen wood free from its frame. Inside, it was musty and dark, but dry. There was a stone fireplace, a rough wooden table with 2 chairs, a cupboard, and through a doorway, a single bedroom with a bed frame, its mattress long since removed or rotted away. "It's not much," Beau said apologetically. "It's shelter," Penelope replied pragmatically. "And right now, that's all that matters." They worked together for the next hour. Alice swept out the worst of the dust and debris while Penelope inventoried their supplies, and Beau checked the integrity of the roof. He found a leak in one corner, but determined it could be patched temporarily with some canvas he'd brought in his saddlebags. He also led the animals up to higher ground where there was grass for grazing, tethering them securely to ensure they wouldn't wander off. By the time he returned to the cabin, Penelope had a small fire going in the fireplace, and the atmosphere inside had already improved considerably. She'd spread their blankets on the floor of the main room and was heating water in a pot she must have brought from home. "I found some tea leaves in my bundle," she explained. "Thought we could all use something warm." "You think of everything," Beau said, genuinely impressed. Penelope smiled, though it didn't quite reach her eyes. Growing up, our mother always said a lady must be prepared for any circumstance. I doubt this is what she had in mind, but the principle stands. Alice emerged from the bedroom, carrying what looked like a bundle of dusty fabric. Look what I found in the trunk in their blankets. They're a bit musty, but they'll help keep us warm tonight. Good find, Beau nodded approvingly. You both are handling this better than most people would. What choice do we have? Penelope said simply, though her hands trembled slightly as she measured out tea leaves. Falling to pieces won't stop the flood. Night fell quickly, bringing with it a chill that seeped through the cabin walls. They ate a simple meal of jerky and hard biscuits from Beau's provisions, supplemented with some cheese and dried apples the sisters had packed. The fire provided both warmth and light, casting long shadows across the walls. Alice fell asleep shortly after eating, wrapped in blankets near the fire. Penelope remained awake, sitting across from Beau at the small table, her face golden in the firelight. "What will happen when the water recedes?" she asked softly, so as not to wake her sister. Beau considered the question. "The bridge will need rebuilding. Your house." He hesitated, not wanting to give false hope. "There will be damage. Mud everywhere, warped floorboards, possibly worse depending on how high the water gets." Penelope nodded, her expression solemn. "I suspected as much. At least we saved what we could. Your parents' ranch is good land." "It can be restored," Beau assured her. "With what money?" she asked, then immediately shook her head. "I'm sorry, that's not your concern." "Maybe it could be," Beau said, the words escaping before he could think better of them. At her questioning look, he continued, "I mean, I've got experience with this sort of thing. Rebuilding, I mean, after my own place flooded back in Texas." "That's very kind of you to offer," Penelope said carefully. An awkward silence fell between them, broken only by the crackling of the fire. Beau mentally kicked himself. 6 months of barely managing to string together a coherent sentence in her presence, and now here he was, practically offering to rebuild her family's home without being asked. "I should check on the animals before turning in," he said finally, rising from the table. "Beau," Penelope called softly as he reached for the door. When he turned, she was standing too, her face partly in shadow. "Thank you, not just for coming to get us, but for being here now." Something in her voice, in the way she looked at him, made his heart skip. "There's nowhere else I'd rather be, Penelope." It was the truth, he realized as he stepped out into the night. Despite the danger, despite the uncertain days ahead, being here with her felt right in a way few things in his life ever had. The next morning dawned clearer, though the flood showed no signs of receding. If anything, the water had risen further during the night, now lapping at the bottom step of the cabin's small porch. Beau had slept fitfully on the floor by the door, waking at every change in the sound of the water outside. He found Penelope already awake, standing on the porch watching the sunrise paint the floodwaters gold and pink. Her hair was loosely braided over one shoulder, and in the early light she looked younger, more vulnerable than the composed woman he'd come to admire from afar. "Morning," he said quietly, coming to stand beside her. "Sleep all right, as well as could be expected," she replied with a small smile. "I kept waking up thinking I was hearing the water coming in." "It's still rising," Beau observed, nodding toward where the water now touched the bottom step. "But slowly. I think the worst of the storm has passed. You think anyone in town is worried about us? I'd bet on it. Sheriff Mills knows I came across to get you and your sister. He'll have people watching the creek, waiting for the waters to go down enough to attempt a crossing. And your ranch, who's looking after it while you're stranded here with us? Miguel's capable. He knows what needs doing." Beau leaned against the porch railing, considering her profile. "Your parents will be worried when they can't get through to your place. Penelope nodded, her expression clouding. Father will be beside himself. Mother too, though she'll hide it better. She turned to face him fully. We should try to get word to town somehow. Let them know we're all safe. I've been thinking about that. There's a spot about 2 miles north where the creek narrows between two bluffs. Even with the flood, it might be possible to rig up a way to send a message across. How? Back in the war, Beau stopped himself, rarely speaking of his time in the Confederate Army. Well, we used to use a sort of pulley system with rope to ferry small supplies across rivers when bridges were destroyed. If I could get a rope across, we could send a note. That's brilliant, Penelope said, her eyes lighting up. We should try it today. We will, Beau promised. But first, let's see to breakfast and make sure this cabin is secure for a few more days. I don't like how close that water's getting. They spent the morning reinforcing the cabin as best they could with limited supplies. Beau showed the sisters how to dig a small trench around the perimeter to divert some of the water, while Penelope discovered a trap door in the floor leading to a small root cellar that was, miraculously, still dry. Alice, proving to be surprisingly resourceful, fashioned a sort of dam using branches and mud to protect the front steps from the encroaching water. After a brief meal, Beau prepared to set out for the narrow point in the creek. He packed a coil of rope, some twine and writing materials in his saddlebags. I'm coming with you, Penelope announced as he was checking Whiskey's saddle. It's dangerous terrain, Beau protested. The ground will be slippery and there's still a lot of debris in the water. All the more reason you shouldn't go alone, she countered. Alice will be fine here for a few hours. She has her books to keep her company, and someone needs to keep an eye on the animals anyway. Her tone brooked no argument, and truthfully, Beau found he didn't want to argue. The prospect of spending a few hours alone with Penelope, away from her sister's curious eyes, was more appealing than he cared to admit. All right, he conceded. But you'll need to ride behind me. The path I'm thinking of is too treacherous for walking. Alice seemed all too pleased to stay behind with her books and the cabin to herself, promising to keep the fire stoked and watch for any changes in the water level. Penelope settled behind Beau on Whiskey's back, her arms wrapped tentatively around his waist. Hold on tighter, he instructed as they set off. Whiskey knows her job, but the ground's unpredictable. Penelope's arms tightened around him, and Beau tried to ignore the warmth that spread through him at her touch. They rode mostly in silence, picking their way carefully along the ridgeline that paralleled the flooded creek below. The landscape was transformed. Fields that should have been greening with spring crops were now shallow lakes. Fence lines marked only by the tops of posts protruding from the murky water, and the occasional roof of an outbuilding visible like a strange island. It's both beautiful and terrible, Penelope observed softly, her chin nearly resting on his shoulder as she looked out over the altered terrain. I've never seen anything like it. Nature has a way of reminding us who's really in charge, Beau replied, guiding Whiskey around a fallen tree. My pa used to say that man's greatest folly is thinking he can tame the land, when all he can really do is learn to live alongside it. Your father sounds like a wise man. He was, Beau said simply. Lost him in '62 during the war. Penelope was quiet for a moment, then asked, Is that when you fought? You started to mention it earlier. Beau rarely spoke of those years, but something about the isolation, about being here with only Penelope, loosened his tongue. Yeah, enlisted at 18, right after Fort Sumter. Spent 3 years fighting for a cause I understood less and less as time went on. What changed your mind? Her voice was gentle, without judgment. Seeing men die over ideas that seemed to benefit only those who weren't doing the fighting, Beau replied after a moment's thought. By 65, when it all ended, I just wanted to find a piece of land far from anywhere armies might march and live quietly. Yet here you are, risking your life crossing flooded creeks to rescue damsels in distress," Penelope said, and he could hear the smile in her voice. "Some risks are worth taking," Beau said, meaning it more than she could know. They reached the Narrows by midday. As Beau had hoped, the creek was constricted here between two rocky bluffs, reducing the distance they would need to span. Still, it was a good 60 feet across, and the water roared through the channel with frightening force. "Now what?" Penelope asked, dismounting carefully. Beau surveyed the scene. "Now we need weight and accuracy." He dug in his saddlebags and pulled out a small leather pouch. "And a bit of luck." Inside the pouch was a smooth, heavy stone that he'd picked up from near the cabin. He tied it securely to the end of his rope. "The idea is to throw this across with enough force that someone on the other side might spot it and understand what it's for," he explained. "Once the rope is secured on both sides, we can run a lighter line the twine and use it to send a message container back and forth." "But how will anyone know to look for a rope here?" Penelope asked reasonably. "That's the luck part," Beau admitted. "But this is the most logical crossing point for miles, and if the sheriff has men watching the creek, this is where they'd be stationed." It took 4 attempts before Beau's throw successfully landed the stone on the far bank, with enough rope to spare that it wouldn't be immediately dragged back into the water. He secured his end around a sturdy oak and then attached the twine to the main rope, creating a primitive pulley system. "Now we wait," he said, settling on a rock beside Penelope. "If anyone's watching, they'll investigate the rope." They sat in companionable silence for a time, watching the churning water below. Penelope huddled into her coat against the chill wind that funneled through the Narrows. "Cold?" Beau asked, noticing her shiver. "A little," she admitted. Without thinking, he put his arm around her shoulders. She stiffened momentarily, then relaxed, leaning slightly into his side. The simple contact sent his heart racing faster than crossing the collapsing bridge had. "Beau," she said after a while, her voice thoughtful, "why have you never spoken more than 2 words to me before yesterday? In all the months you've been in Palisade?" The directness of her question caught him off guard. "I wasn't sure what to say, I guess." "You don't strike me as a man at a loss for words generally." "I'm not, usually." He stared out at the water, finding it easier than looking at her. "You're different." "Different how?" Beau took a deep breath. After facing death crossing that bridge, speaking his mind shouldn't be this difficult. "You're educated. Refined. I'm just a cowboy with dirt under his fingernails and more cattle than conversation." Penelope was quiet for so long that he finally turned to look at her. She was watching him with an expression he couldn't quite read. "You think I care about those things?" she asked finally. "Education can be gained, Beau. Character is built. And you've shown more of that in the past day than most men I've known have shown in years." Before he could respond, a movement on the far bank caught his eye. "Look," he exclaimed, pointing to where a figure in a sheriff's badge was examining the rope they'd thrown across. They both stood, waving their arms to get the man's attention. When he spotted them, relief visibly washed over his features. It was Deputy Anderson, Sheriff Mills's right-hand man. "You folks all right over there?" he shouted across the divide. "We're fine," Beau called back. "At the old Thompson cabin. Bridge is gone, we know," Anderson replied. "Whole town's worried about you 3. Sheriff's organizing a rebuilding effort as soon as the water's down." Understanding their pulley system immediately, Anderson attached a small oilskin packet to the twine line. Beau reeled it in carefully. Inside was a note from Sheriff Mills, confirming what Anderson had shouted, that the town was worried but organizing relief efforts. and that word had been sent to Denver to intercept the Wallaces before they tried to return home. There was also a brief update on conditions in town: minimal damage, no casualties, and most importantly, a pencil and paper for them to send back their own message. Penelope took charge of writing their reply, detailing their situation, confirming all three were safe, and specifically requesting that her parents be told not to worry. She hesitated before signing it, pencil hovering over the paper. "Should I add anything else?" she asked Beau. "Maybe mention we have provisions for a few days, but fresh supplies would be welcome when a crossing becomes possible," he suggested. She nodded and added this information before signing the note with both her name and Alice's. Beau added his own signature below, then carefully wrapped the message in the oilskin and sent it back across the churning waters. Deputy Anderson read it immediately, nodded in understanding, and gave them a thumbs-up signal before shouting, "We'll check in daily, same time." With their communication line established, Beau and Penelope headed back to the cabin, both feeling considerably lighter. The knowledge that the town knew their situation and that Penelope's parents would be informed brought immense relief. The ride back was more relaxed, despite the deteriorating conditions around them. The flood had claimed more land while they were gone, but the ridge they followed remained safe. Penelope's arms around Beau's waist felt less tentative now, and they talked more freely about his ranch, her family's homestead, life in Palisade, and their histories before coming to Colorado. "I never wanted to come west," Penelope confessed. "I was perfectly content in Boston with my books and my piano lessons and my friends. When Father announced we were moving to Colorado territory, I cried for 3 days straight. And now?" Beau asked. "Now I can't imagine being anywhere else," she said softly. "There's a freedom here that I never had back east, room to breathe, to think, to become whoever I want to be." "That's what drew me too," Beau agreed. "After the war, Texas felt confining, too many memories, too many expectations. Here, a man is judged by what he does, not who his people were or which side he fought on." They crested the final rise before the cabin, and Beau reined in whiskey to take in the view. The floodwaters glinted in the afternoon sun, transforming the valley into a vast, temporary lake. The cabin stood like an island amid the encroaching water, which had now risen to the top step of the porch. "The water's still rising," Penelope observed, concern evident in her voice. "Faster than I expected," Beau agreed grimly. "We may need to move to higher ground if it continues at this rate." When they reached the cabin, Alice was waiting anxiously on the porch, her face brightening when she saw them. "Thank goodness! I was starting to worry," she exclaimed as they dismounted. "The water's come up 3 more inches since you left." Beau frowned, examining the waterline. "At this rate, the cabin floor could be underwater by morning. We need to prepare to evacuate if necessary. Is the root cellar still dry?" Alice nodded. "Checked it an hour ago. Not a drop." "Good. Let's move our most essential supplies down there just in case. If the main floor floods, we can retreat upstairs, but the cellar gives us a dry place to store food and other necessities." They spent the remainder of the afternoon preparing for the worst, moving supplies to the cellar, reinforcing their makeshift water barriers, and bringing the milk cow and calf closer to the cabin for easier evacuation if needed. Beau fashioned a simple raft from some old planks he found behind the cabin, securing them together with rope from his saddlebags. It wasn't much, but it could help float their supplies if they had to leave in a hurry. As night fell, the water had risen another inch, now threatening to spill onto the cabin floor. They ate a subdued dinner, all too aware of the precariousness of their situation. The mood was tense until Alice, ever resilient, suggested they tell stories to pass the time. "Like we did during that blizzard last winter, Penny," she said, using her nickname for her sister. "Remember how Father told us about his adventures panning for gold in California?" Penelope's expression softened at the memory. "And Mother recited all those poems she learned in finishing school." "You should tell us a story, Mr. Northrop," Alice said, turning her bright gaze on Beau. "Something exciting from your cowboy days." Beau chuckled, warming to the girl's enthusiasm. "I don't know how exciting my stories are, but I did once track a mountain lion that was preying on my calves." The evening passed more pleasantly after that, with stories and even laughter despite their circumstances. When Alice finally dozed off by the fire, Penelope and Beau continued talking in low voices, their conversation flowing more easily than either would have thought possible just days before. "You're good with her," Beau observed, nodding toward the sleeping Alice. "She looks up to you." "She's the easy one," Penelope replied with affection. "Always sunny, always curious. Sometimes I envy her optimism." "And you're not optimistic." "I'm practical," she said after a moment's consideration. "I hope for the best but prepare for difficulties. It's served me well enough." "Is that why you never seemed to notice me watching you all these months?" Beau asked, surprising himself with his boldness. Penelope's eyes widened and a blush colored her cheeks. "I noticed," she said quietly. "I just wasn't sure what it meant, or whether you'd ever do more than watch from across a room." The admission hung between them, changing the air in the small cabin. Beau's heart hammered in his chest as he realized what she was saying, that she had been aware of his attention, perhaps even welcomed it. "I should have spoken up sooner," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "Yes, you should have," she agreed, but there was a smile in her eyes. Before either could say more, a loud crack split the night, followed by a rushing sound that made them both jump to their feet. Water began seeping under the cabin door. "It's breached the steps," Beau said, immediately moving to action. "We need to wake Alice and move upstairs now." The next few hours were a blur of activity as they relocated to the cabin's small loft. The water rose steadily, eventually covering the main floor to a depth of several inches. From their vantage point upstairs, they could see by moonlight that the landscape around the cabin had been transformed. What had been land earlier that day was now entirely underwater. "Will it keep rising?" Alice asked fearfully, huddled in a blanket by the small window. "Hard to say," Beau answered honestly. "But the cabin stood for years. The walls are solid. We're safer here than trying to move in the dark." Nonetheless, none of them slept much that night. Beau took turns with Penelope keeping watch at the window, monitoring the water level and checking that their improvised raft remained secured to the porch railing. In the small hours of the morning during one of these watches, Penelope joined Beau at the window, her shoulder brushing against his as they peered out into the moonlit flood. "I've been thinking," she said softly, "about what you said earlier, about speaking up sooner." Beau turned to face her, suddenly very aware of how close they were in the confined space. "What about it?" "Life's unpredictable," she said, gesturing to the floodwaters surrounding them. "If this has taught me anything, it's that waiting for the perfect moment is a luxury we might not always have." "Penelope," Beau began, but she shook her head. "Let me finish. I've watched you too, Beau. Every Sunday at church, every time you came into the general store while I was there. I noticed the way you always tipped your hat to me, how you never failed to ask after my family, even when the words seemed to cost you something to say." She took a deep breath. "What I'm trying to say is, I think we've both been waiting for some perfect moment that might never come. And now here we are, stranded in a flood with an uncertain tomorrow, and I find myself wondering why we've wasted so much time." The moonlight filtered through the window, casting her face in silver and shadow. Beau raised a hand to her cheek, half expecting her to pull away. She didn't. "I've never been good with words," he said quietly. "Especially around beautiful, educated women who make me forget my own name." That drew a soft laugh from her. "You seem to be managing just fine now." "Maybe it took a natural disaster to knock some sense into me," he replied, his thumb gently tracing her cheekbone. "Or perhaps," she whispered, leaning slightly into his touch, "we just needed to be stranded together with no distractions and nowhere to run." Beau's heart was pounding so loudly he was certain she must hear it. Slowly, giving her every chance to back away, he leaned forward and pressed his lips to hers. The kiss was tentative at first, a question more than a demand. But when Penelope's arms slid around his neck, the kiss deepened, becoming an answer to questions they'd both been too afraid to ask. When they finally pulled apart, both slightly breathless, Beau rested his forehead against hers. "I've wanted to do that since the first day I saw you," he admitted. "I've wanted you to," she replied with a smile that made his heart skip. Though perhaps not under such dramatic circumstances. A soft sound from across the room reminded them they weren't alone. Alice had shifted in her sleep, mumbling something incoherent before settling again. They moved slightly apart, though Penelope kept her hand in his. "We should try to get some rest," Beau suggested. "Tomorrow could be challenging if the water keeps rising." Penelope nodded, but neither made a move to separate further. Eventually, they settled against the wall beside the window, shoulders touching, hands entwined, and fell into a light sleep as dawn began to lighten the sky. Morning brought both relief and new concerns. The water had stopped rising, a blessing, but now surrounded the cabin entirely, creating an island where there had once been solid ground. The animals were safe on the higher ridge where Beau had moved them, but accessing them would require swimming through the floodwaters. "I need to check on them," Beau said after they'd assessed their situation. "Make sure they haven't broken free in the night." "It's too dangerous to swim," Penelope protested. "The current could sweep you away." "That's why I made the raft," Beau explained. "I'll pole my way across to the ridge, check the animals, and come straight back. An hour, tops." Penelope clearly didn't like the plan but couldn't offer a better alternative. The animals needed tending and they all knew it. Reluctantly, she helped him prepare, packing a small bag with rope and some feed for Whiskey. "Be careful," she said as he prepared to lower himself and the raft from the window, the main door now being completely underwater. "Please." "I've survived worse than a little flood," Beau assured her with more confidence than he felt, remembering all too well the power of the water that had destroyed the bridge. The raft, crude as it was, proved surprisingly effective. Using a long pole he'd fashioned from a broken roof beam, Beau navigated through the slower-moving waters surrounding the cabin. The real challenge came when he reached the edge of what had been the yard, where the current ran swifter. From the cabin window, Penelope and Alice watched anxiously as he battled against the flow, the raft sometimes spinning completely around before he regained control. There was a heart-stopping moment when the pole became stuck in mud and nearly pulled from his grasp, but Beau recovered and eventually reached the slope where the animals were tethered. To his relief, both Whiskey and Buttercup with her calf were safe, though clearly agitated by the strange circumstances. He spent some time soothing them, ensuring they had access to grass and water, and securing their tethers more firmly to withstand another day of waiting. The return journey was easier with the current helping rather than hindering, though controlling the raft's direction proved challenging. He arrived back at the cabin breathless but triumphant, to be pulled through the window by 4 eager hands. "The animals are fine," he reported as Penelope handed him a towel for his wet hands and face. "But we're truly isolated now. The waters created a channel between us and the ridge that's too dangerous to cross frequently. What does that mean for our supplies?" Alice asked, practical despite her youth. "We need to be even more careful with rationing," Beau said grimly, "and hope the water starts receding soon." The day passed slowly, marked by small tasks to improve their situation, collecting rainwater from the roof through a leak for additional drinking water, reorganizing their supplies, and taking turns watching for any signs of change in the flood level. By late afternoon, Beau was certain the water had dropped by a few inches, though not enough to make a significant difference yet. As promised, they returned to the Narrows at the appointed time, finding Deputy Anderson waiting faithfully on the opposite bank. Through their improvised communication system, they learned that the town was recovering well, that the Wallaces had been successfully contacted in Denver and were anxiously waiting for conditions to improve enough to return, and that the earliest estimates suggested it would be at least a week before the creek might be crossable again. "A week," Penelope repeated as they rowed back to the cabin, the news settling heavily between them. "Our supplies will stretch if we're careful," Beau said, trying to sound optimistic. "And the water should start receding faster once the runoff from the mountain slows." "It's not just the supplies I'm worried about," she admitted. "It's being in such close quarters. The three of us, I mean." Beau understood immediately what she wasn't saying. The kiss they'd shared, the new understanding between them, these things were difficult to explore with Alice constantly present in their small refuge. "Your sister seems remarkably unobservant when she wants to be," he pointed out with a hint of humor. "Have you noticed how conveniently absorbed in her book she becomes whenever we speak quietly to each other?" Penelope laughed softly, her arms tightening around his waist. "She's always been a romantic at heart. She probably thinks she's helping Cupid's arrow find its mark." "Smart girl," Beau murmured, covering her hands with one of his own where they rested against his stomach. The next few days fell into a pattern. Each morning, Beau would raft across to tend the animals, returning with milk from Buttercup and occasionally small game he managed to snare on the ridge. The water receded steadily, and by the fourth day, the main floor of the cabin was dry again, though surrounded by mud and standing water. Their daily trips to communicate with town brought encouraging news. The bridge rebuilding was being planned, supplies were being gathered for them, and the Wallaces were safely waiting in Denver until word came that they could return. Throughout it all, Beau and Penelope grew closer. Without the social constraints of town life, they spoke freely, sharing hopes and fears, memories and dreams. In the evenings, after Alice retired to the loft, they would sit together by the fire, sometimes talking late into the night, sometimes simply enjoying the comfort of each other's presence. Occasionally, when they were certain Alice was asleep, they would exchange soft kisses and whispered words that made the isolation seem less like a hardship and more like a gift. On the sixth day, the landscape had transformed again. The floodwaters had receded enough that much of the land around the cabin was merely sodden rather than submerged. Beau was able to walk to the animals rather than raft across, though the mud made for treacherous going. "I think we could make it back to town tomorrow," he announced after returning from his morning check. The waters dropped enough at the Narrows that crossing wouldn't be impossible with the right preparation. The news brought mixed reactions. Alice was ecstatic at the prospect of returning to civilization, but Penelope's response was more measured. "Is it safe enough?" she asked, concern evident in her voice. "I don't want to risk another dangerous crossing if waiting a few more days would be wiser." "It's your call," Beau said, understanding her caution. "But your parents will be anxious to see you both, and our supplies are running low." In the end, they decided to attempt the crossing the following day if conditions continued to improve. They spent the afternoon packing their belongings, cleaning the cabin as best they could to leave it in good condition, and planning how they would manage the animals during the trek to the Narrows. That evening had a bittersweet quality, all three aware that their unusual time together was coming to an end. Alice retired early, citing the need for rest before their journey, though her knowing smile as she climbed to the loft suggested she had other motives for giving her sister and Beau privacy. Alone by the fire, Penelope seemed unusually quiet, her gaze fixed on the flames. "Having second thoughts about tomorrow?" Beau asked, settling beside her on the hearth. "Not about the crossing," she replied, turning to look at him. "About what happens after." Beau understood immediately. "You're worried things will change once we're back in town." She nodded, vulnerability plain in her eyes. "Here, everything's simple. It's just us, facing circumstances together. But in Palisade, there are expectations, social niceties. You think I'll go back to watching you from across rooms instead of telling you how I feel?" Beau asked, taking her hand in his. "Will you?" The question was direct, her gaze steady despite the uncertainty in her voice. "Penelope," Beau said, bringing her hand to his lips. "The only thing that flood did was wash away my excuses for not speaking up sooner. I crossed a collapsing bridge to reach you. Do you think I'd let a little thing like proper society keep me from your side now?" Her smile bloomed slowly like a sunrise. "When you put it that way." "Besides," he continued, emboldened by the warmth in her eyes, "I have it on good authority that your father approves of my ranching methods, might go some way toward approving of me as a suitor for his daughter. Is that what you are now? My suitor?" There was teasing in her tone, but something serious underneath. "If you'll have me," Beau replied, suddenly earnest. "Penelope, these days with you, they've been the most challenging and yet the most rewarding of my life. I don't want to go back to the way things were before." "Neither do I," she whispered, leaning forward to kiss him softly. "Though perhaps next time we could manage a courtship that doesn't involve natural disasters." Beau laughed, drawing her closer. "I make no promises. Seems the elements conspire to bring us together." They spent the evening planning for the future as much as for the next day's journey. Beau would speak to her father formally when the Wallaces returned. They would court properly, but without the hesitation that had marked their previous interactions, and when the time was right. "We'll know," Penelope said simply, her head resting against his shoulder as the fire burned low. "After all this, I think we'll know." Morning came clear and bright, the sun burning away the mist that hung over the sodden landscape. They set out early, Penelope riding Whiskey while Alice walked alongside, leading Buttercup and her calf. Beau ranged ahead, testing the ground for hidden dangers and marking the safest path through the muddy terrain. The journey to the Narrows took longer than expected, the mud making for slow progress, but they arrived by midday to find not just Deputy Anderson waiting, but Sheriff Mills himself, along with Miguel and several other men from town. "Northrop," the sheriff called, relief evident in his voice. "Figured you might try crossing today. We've been working on a solution." The men had constructed a simple rope bridge, little more than 2 parallel ropes to walk on with 2 higher ropes to hold for balance, but it would serve to get them across without risking the still swift current below. "Ladies first," Sheriff Mills instructed once they were close enough to communicate easily. "We'll secure a harness line as well, so there's no chance of falling." Alice, showing surprising courage, volunteered to cross first. With a safety rope secured around her waist, she stepped onto the makeshift bridge, her young face set with determination. She moved slowly but steadily, eyes fixed on the far shore where encouraging shouts urged her on. When she reached the other side, a cheer went up from the men. Penelope went next, after a lingering glance at Beau that held both promise and regret for their ending isolation. She crossed with grace, her movements deliberate and careful, never once looking down at the churning water below. Getting the animals across proved more challenging. Eventually, they had to blindfold Whiskey and guide her step by step over the ropes while men on both sides steadied her with additional lines. Buttercup flatly refused the crossing, so Beau fashioned a makeshift harness that allowed the men to essentially pull her and the calf across the narrowest part of the creek, where they could swim with guidance. Beau was the last to cross, making the journey seem almost easy compared to the complications with the animals. When his boots touched the far bank, Penelope was waiting, propriety forgotten as she threw her arms around him in a fierce embrace. "We made it," she whispered against his neck. "I told you we would," he replied, holding her just as tightly, uncaring of the knowing looks from the sheriff and his men. The return to Palisade was something of a triumph, with townsfolk coming out to welcome them back as they rode in, mudded and tired but safe. The Wallace sisters were taken in by Mrs. Peterson, the minister's wife, until their parents could return, while Beau headed back to his ranch with Miguel, Whiskey following dutifully behind. The separation, after days of constant proximity, felt strange to them both. But Beau called on Penelope the very next day, bringing wildflowers he'd gathered from the ridge behind his property, and staying for tea with Mrs. Peterson as a proper chaperone. The day after that, he helped with the organization of supplies for the bridge rebuilding. And the day after that, he sat beside Penelope in church, a public declaration of his intentions that set the town gossips chattering. When the Wallaces returned from Denver a week later, Beau was waiting at the stage depot, hat in hand, ready to speak to Mr. Wallace about his intentions toward Penelope. To his surprise, Mr. Wallace clapped him on the shoulder before he could say a word. "Northrop," the older man said warmly, "my daughter's written to tell us everything. Seems I owe you a debt I can never repay." "No debt, sir," Beau replied honestly. "I did what anyone would do, but no one else did they?" Mr. Wallace pointed out. "Just you. Crossing that bridge when others said it couldn't be done." Later that evening, properly invited to dinner at the Peterson home where the Wallaces were staying until their homestead could be assessed, Beau found himself seated beside Penelope, their knees occasionally touching under the table in a way that sent warmth flooding through him, despite the formal setting. After dinner, Mr. Wallace invited Beau to join him for a pipe on the porch, a ritual that Beau understood was as much about sizing him up as it was about enjoying tobacco. But the conversation was easier than he'd anticipated, with Mr. Wallace speaking openly about his concerns for rebuilding the homestead, and Beau offering practical suggestions based on his own experience. "Penelope tells me you're interested in courting her properly," Mr. Wallace said finally, coming to the heart of the matter. "Yes, sir," Beau replied without hesitation, "with your blessing if possible." The older man studied him for a long moment. "You know, when we moved here from Boston, I had certain ideas about the type of man my daughters might eventually marry. Educated men, perhaps, men of business or profession." Beau nodded, bracing himself for rejection. "But I've learned something in our time out west," Mr. Wallace continued. "Character matters more than schooling. Action speaks louder than words." He puffed thoughtfully on his pipe. "You crossed a flooding creek on a collapsing bridge to save my girls, then kept them safe when you could all have perished. I'd say that tells me everything I need to know about your character, Northrop." "Thank you, sir," Beau said, relief washing through him. "That said," Mr. Wallace added with a hint of steel in his voice, "she's my firstborn. Her happiness means everything to me and her mother." "You understand what I'm saying." "Completely, sir," Beau assured him. "I intend to do right by her in every way." "Then you have our blessing," Mr. Wallace said, extending his hand, "though I suspect you had Penelope's blessing already." The rebuilding of both the bridge and the Wallace homestead became community efforts, with folks from all around Palisade pitching in. The flood damage was extensive, requiring new floorboards throughout the main level of the house, replanting of the ruined crops and repairs to outbuildings. But with many hands, the work progressed steadily. Beau was there nearly every day, working alongside Mr. Wallace and the other men, offering his expertise where he could. In the evenings, he would often stay for supper, the family's conversation flowing easily around him as if he had always been a part of their circle. His courtship of Penelope flourished in these busy days. They found moments together between tasks, walks to check on the new plantings, quiet conversations on the porch after dinner, occasional rides to town for supplies that somehow always took longer than strictly necessary. With each passing day, Beau found himself more certain that what had begun in crisis had grown into something enduring and true. One evening in late summer, with the Wallace homestead finally restored and the new bridge standing solid over Duro Creek, Beau asked Penelope to ride with him to a special place he wanted to show her. She agreed readily, curious about his unusually secretive manner. He led her to the bluff overlooking the creek crossing where the old bridge had once stood. The summer sun was beginning to set, painting the sky in shades of gold and pink that reflected on the now calm waters below. "It seems impossible that it was ever so dangerous," Penelope remarked, looking down at the gentle flow of the creek. "Nature's fury and nature's peace, all in the same place." "That's why I wanted to bring you here," Beau said, taking her hand, "to remember where it all began. With you risking your life to cross a flooding creek," she teased gently. "With me finally finding the courage to reach for something I wanted more than I feared failure," he corrected, turning to face her fully. "Penelope, that flood changed everything for me. Not just because it brought us together, but because it showed me what matters most." He took a deep breath, suddenly nervous despite all they had shared. "I love you. I think I've loved you from the first moment I saw you. And if you'll have me, I want to build a life with you, one that can weather any storm that comes our way." Tears shimmered in Penelope's eyes as Beau reached into his pocket and withdrew a small ring, a simple gold band set with a single pearl. "It was my mother's," he explained softly. "The only thing of value I brought with me from Texas, besides whiskey." "It's beautiful," she whispered, her voice catching. "Penelope Wallace," Beau said, dropping to one knee before her, "will you marry me?" "Yes," she answered without hesitation, a brilliant smile breaking through her tears. "Yes, Beau Northrop, I will marry you." As he slipped the ring onto her finger and rose to take her in his arms, Beau thought of that desperate moment on the collapsing bridge, how close he had come to losing everything before he'd even known what he stood to gain. The kiss they shared atop the bluff sealed a promise forged in flood waters and tempered in the quiet moments they'd found together afterward. They were married that October, when the aspen trees painted the mountainsides gold and the air held the first hint of winter's approach. The ceremony was held in Palisade's small church, filled to capacity with townsfolk who had watched their story unfold. Alice, resplendent in a new blue dress, served as Penelope's maid of honor, while Miguel stood proudly as Beau's best man. Penelope was radiant in a cream-colored gown. Her mother had ordered from Denver, carrying wildflowers gathered from the ridge behind what would now be their home. Beau's ranch expanded over the summer to accommodate his new bride's hopes for the future, including the piano that had arrived by wagon train just a week before the wedding. The celebration afterward lasted well into the evening, with dancing and feasting and toasts to the couple's future. When they finally departed for the ranch, riding together on whiskey with Penelope seated before him in the saddle, the entire town lined the main street to wave them off. Happy? Beau asked softly as they crested the hill that would take them home. More than I ever thought possible, Penelope replied, leaning back against his chest. Though I do have one request. Anything, he promised, pressing a kiss to her temple. Next spring, when the snow melts and the creeks rise again, she said with a smile in her voice, let's stay on high ground. Beau's laughter rang out across the evening air. That, Mrs. Northrop, is a promise I'm more than happy to keep. The seasons turned, as they always do, bringing changes both expected and surprising. Their first winter as husband and wife was harsh but beautiful, with snow piling deep around the ranch house and long evenings spent by the fire, planning for the future while the wind howled outside. Beau expanded the cattle operation, while Penelope, drawing on her education, kept meticulous books and wrote to Eastern contacts her father had introduced, securing better prices for their beef. When spring came again, the creeks swelled with snowmelt, but nothing like the devastating flood of the previous year. True to his word, Beau kept them safely on high ground, though they rode out together to watch the newly rebuilt bridge withstand its first test against the rushing waters. Summer brought news that filled them both with nervous excitement. Penelope was expecting their first child. The prospect of fatherhood terrified and thrilled Beau in equal measure, while Penelope faced the future with her characteristic blend of practical planning and quiet faith that they would manage whatever came. Their son, William James Northrop, was born on a clear January night in 1870, with Mrs. Peterson serving as midwife and Alice pacing anxiously outside the bedroom door. When Beau was finally allowed in to see his wife and child, the sight of Penelope holding their son, tired but triumphant, nearly brought him to his knees. "He looks like you," she said softly as Beau perched carefully on the edge of the bed, one finger gently tracing the baby's perfect, tiny features. "Poor kid," Beau replied with a shaky laugh, overwhelmed by the love that swelled in his chest for both of them. "He'll be handsome just like his father," Penelope insisted, leaning her head against Beau's shoulder. "And brave too, I expect." "Let's hope he inherits your brains," Beau countered, pressing a kiss to her forehead. "And your heart." Life settled into new rhythms after William's birth. The ranch prospered under their joint management, with Beau handling the day-to-day operations while Penelope managed their growing business connections. Alice, now 18 and showing signs of her sister's intelligence and determination, often helped with William when she wasn't pursuing her own studies, declaring her intention to become a schoolteacher. The Wallaces remained close by, their homestead fully restored and thriving. Mr. Wallace had taken to ranching with unexpected enthusiasm, often consulting with Beau on matters of livestock and land management. Mrs. Wallace doted on her grandson, regularly taking the buggy over to spend afternoons with Penelope and the baby, knitting tiny garments and offering the wisdom of experience. By the time William turned 3, the Northrop Ranch had grown significantly, now employing 6 full-time hands including Miguel, who had been promoted to foreman. The original cabin had been expanded into a proper home, with a stone fireplace, glass windows, and even the luxury of a cast-iron bathtub in a small room off the kitchen. It was in that home, on a warm evening in the spring of 1873, that Beau found Penelope sitting on the porch swing, watching William chase fireflies in the yard with the kind of focused determination only a 3-year-old can muster. She had a peculiar smile playing about her lips, one that Beau had come to recognize over the years. "You're plotting something, Mrs. Northrop," he said, settling beside her and drawing her close against his side. "Not plotting," she corrected, turning that smile up to him. "Just thinking about how our family might look with one more addition." Beau's heart skipped a beat. "Are you saying—" Penelope nodded, her eyes bright with joy and just a hint of mischief. "Dr. Turner confirmed it yesterday. Come winter, William will have a little brother or sister." Their daughter, Elizabeth Rose Northrop, arrived during the first snowfall of December. A tiny, fierce thing with her mother's determined spirit evident from the first breath she drew. William, initially suspicious of this small, noisy creature who demanded so much attention, soon appointed himself her official protector, solemnly explaining to anyone who would listen that it was his job to keep his sister safe, just like Pa did for Ma during the big flood. The story of that flood and the bridge had become something of a legend in Palisade, growing more dramatic with each retelling. In town, Beau would sometimes overhear exaggerated versions that had him swimming through raging waters while fighting off mountain lions, or Penelope defending the cabin against bandits while the waters rose around them. He never corrected these embellishments, understanding that communities need their stories, their shared myths that bind people together. Besides, the truth that a lonely cowboy had found the courage to cross a dangerous divide for the woman who would become his wife was dramatic enough in its own right. As their children grew, so did the Northrop legacy in Palisade. Beau served terms on the town council, helping to guide the community's growth as the railroad finally connected them to the wider world in 1878. Penelope, drawing on her education, established the town's first proper library, donating many books from her own collection to get it started. William, inheriting his father's affinity for the land and his mother's sharp mind, grew into a thoughtful young man who could break a wild horse in the morning and discuss literature around the dinner table in the evening. Elizabeth, fierce and independent from her first steps, showed an uncanny talent with numbers that served her well when she later took over the business side of the ranch operations. On the 20th anniversary of the flood that had brought them together, Beau and Penelope returned to the bluff overlooking Duro Creek. They were older now, silver threading through Beau's dark hair, laugh lines etched permanently around Penelope's eyes, but the bond between them had only strengthened with the passing years. "You ever wonder what might have happened if that flood hadn't come?" Penelope asked as they stood hand in hand, looking down at the placid creek below, now crossed by a sturdy iron bridge that had replaced the wooden one 10 years earlier. "Sometimes," Beau admitted, "though I like to think I would have found my courage eventually." "I'm not so sure," she teased, bumping her shoulder against his. "You were awfully determined to admire me from afar." "And you were perfectly content to let me," he countered with a grin, drawing her into his arms. "Perhaps," she conceded, her eyes softening as she looked up at him. "Or perhaps I was just waiting for the right moment to meet you halfway." "Halfway across a flooding creek on a collapsing bridge," Beau mused. "Not exactly the romantic beginning most couples dream of." "I wouldn't change a thing," Penelope said firmly. "Not one single moment of our story." As the sun began to set over the western mountains, painting the valley in the same golden hues that had illuminated their engagement 20 years earlier, Beau kissed his wife with all the tenderness and passion of a love that had weathered storms both literal and figurative, emerging stronger for having been tested. "Neither would I," he whispered against her lips. Neither would I. In the decades that followed, Palisade grew and changed with the times. The railroad brought new people, new ideas, new opportunities. The original settlers grew older, their children taking up the mantles of leadership and innovation. Through it all, the story of Beau Northrop crossing the flooding creek to rescue Penelope Wallace remained a touchstone in local lore, a reminder of courage, determination, and the power of love to bridge even the most dangerous divides. When Beau passed peacefully in his sleep at the age of 82, with Penelope holding his hand and their children, grandchildren, and even 2 great-grandchildren gathered around, the entire town mourned. The funeral procession stretched from the church all the way to the cemetery on the hill, where he was laid to rest with a view of both the ranch he had built and the creek he had crossed. Penelope lived 5 more years, maintaining an active role in town affairs and ranch operations until her final days. When she joined Beau beneath the cottonwood tree on the hillside, the marker that united them in death as in life bore a simple inscription beneath their names and dates. They crossed the flood together and found safe harbor in each other's hearts.